Hi everyone, this is the second video in my series, the Jesus Myth series. This one's going to be called From Moses to Gnosticism. So right off the bat, Moses did not exist. This is not a radical stance in critical scholarship. In fact, it's the consensus at this point. It's the overwhelming consensus. The only people who don't really like this idea are apologists and very conservative scholars on the matter. But the development that Moses did not exist was happening very early. By 1807, Wilhelm Martin Liebrecht de Wet, in criticism of Mosaic history, contended it's impossible to extract history from myth regarding Moses. So it was such a mythical tale that there's no way to tease out a historical figure from the stories that remain. Margaret Barker has characterized the development of this scholarship as a history of subtractions. First, the mythical elements, then the authorship of the Pentateuch, which couldn't have been written by a single author, let alone Moses. Deuteronomy was perhaps 500 years or even more after Moses' time frame. And we know that Mosaic law was probably a later insertion into what we would call the Torah or the Pentateuch. William Deaver, who is an American archaeologist and distinguished professor, said in 1993, the overwhelming scholarly consensus today is that Moses is a mythical figure. So this was what is that, 25 years ago that Deaver was saying that. And John Van Seters, who is a very well-respected scholar in Old Testament studies, said in 1987, the quest for the historical Moses is a futile exercise. He now belongs only to legend. One of the ways we know that Moses didn't exist is because he has such clear parallels to earlier myths. There's a lot more that I'm not going to discuss here, but I think the most obvious one is the one of Sargon of Akkad, whose infancy story included hiding a child. He was abandoned by his mother, placed in a reed basket with bitumen, which is asphalt, and rushes on the water. He has royal lineage. So what we know is that this is just part of a literary genre, probably, I guess, a proto-hero's journey or something like that. But Moses is an Egyptian name, and this isn't really even debated either. I mean, this, I think, for any scholar who is looking at this, they know that Moses is an Egyptian name, and of course, there are a lot of run-ins with Egypt in the Moses story. But what it seems to be is a reworking of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses, and so Ramses is born of the god Ra, right? So you take out the Ra, and you would just be born of the god, or born of God. So Ramses was in the 13th century BCE, which is kind of near where Moses is too in supposed history. But we also have an absolute lack of archaeological evidence. The plagues, the Exodus, the defeat of the Pharaoh's army, characters described in the Moses story, all of these are complete fiction. And we also have time frame errors, what are known as anachronisms, references to camels in Exodus 9:3, which would have meant that the story was written much later. Moses' death is discussed, which apologists and conservative scholars will say something like, well, it was written by Joshua, son of Nun. But, of course, no such claim is made, really. No such claim was originally made. So these anachronisms are so numerous, according to scholars, that they're more the rule than the exception. So Moses didn't exist. This is not debated among scholars, really, not among critical scholars. So this raises the question, why invent Moses then? So when you take a step back and look at the subtext, Moses represented a new or evolved religion. There is now in the story of Moses a clear monotheistic distinction based on revealed law and a single deity. in the book of Deuteronomy and other places throughout the Torah, there's a clear rejection of pagan and quasi-pagan ideas such as non-temple altars and sacred poles, which were called Asherah. Some passages include, "The Lord your God destroyed from among you everyone who followed the Baal. Observe the laws carefully, for this will show your wisdom. Do not become corrupt and make yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman. And when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and etc., do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping." So clearly, Moses replaces a paradigm which included all of these things, because if it didn't, these wouldn't be included. These are all, I think, in early Deuteronomy. So just like in Christianity, they have a problem. And that problem is, why are God's chosen people being so demolished in wars against outsiders? And there needs to be a theological reason to explain that. Otherwise, you're not really God's chosen people. So one such explanation is found in the passage. "If you then become corrupt and make any kind of idols, I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you this day, that you will quickly perish from the land, and that you are crossing the Jordan to possess." So what they're doing here is they're retrofitting. They know that the temple was destroyed, and they know that external people came in and conquered them. And so they're writing texts from the basis of the historical perspective to tell them, oh, by the way, if you do anything that was like what you did, you will be destroyed. And so this is the explanation for why the temple was destroyed and why God's chosen people weren't God's chosen people anymore. It's because the people were worshiping idols and such, and had very celestial concerns that were something other than what were of the agenda of the author of Deuteronomy and other sources. So it's difficult to know exactly when Moses gets integrated into the Pentateuch. Scholars in the 1800s noticed that some books of the Torah use the term Yahweh and some use Elohim. There were also doublets or incompatible repetitions, sometimes in the same book, perhaps in the same chapter. This eventually gives rise to the realization that Moses could not have written the Torah at all, because the same author would not have mixed the terms Yahweh and Elohim like that. So this eventually, by the 1800s, gives the late 1800s, gives rise to the documentary hypothesis, as argued by a Julius Wellhausen. The documentary hypothesis, which is shown in this upper corner here, has four major hypothesized Old Testament sources. There is J, or the Yahvist source. There is E, the Elohist source. So this is differentiating between where the author has a concern for Elohim versus where the author has a concern for Yahweh. And the presumption is that these fed into a single source and then were appended by a Deuteronomy source, which is a completely the style of writing in Deuteronomy is so different than those other sources that there must have been a different author of Deuteronomy. From there, you get the priestly sources appending to the JE source, and other redactors coming in after that, eventually leading to the Torah. So this was a very complicated model A lot of people still use it today. Not most critical scholars, but a lot of conservative scholars, I think, like it. But of course, they still must, I think, admit, given the multiple authors, that Moses, of course, did not write at least the entirety of it. But this model places the Yahweh source in the 10th century BCE. So, starting in the 1970s, and there are all kinds of models for how this is written, but in the 1970s and after, John Van Seters, and along with other authors, started advocating this idea of the supplementary hypothesis. This puts Deuteronomy first. And this is a big deal, putting Deuteronomy first, because if you read Deuteronomy, you see that Deuteronomy is coming out of the gate swinging, really advocating the rejection of old pagan ideas and an integration of a lot of new ideas, which are mostly monotheistic. One of the things, oh, by the way, the Elohim source goes away entirely. Scholars now reject this idea that there is an Elohist source. Basically, that Deuteronomy is drawing off of a lot of earlier ideas, both oral and probably some written too, but a lot of oral traditions, and Deuteronomy is canonizing it, basically. But what this does is it puts the Old Testament into the 7th century BCE. So the writings of the Bible are much younger than what used to be presumed. So we're in the 600s, leading up to the Babylonian invasion. So this means that Moses might have been as late as the 4th century BCE. So the actual character Moses would have been integrated on top of an idea that was becoming increasingly monotheistic. But it also puts the priestly source, which is basically a collection of writings that are very concerned with priestly ritual and things like that throughout the Pentateuch. But what this means is that the transitional moment in Judaism was the so-called Deuteronomic Reform, where Josiah's high priest discovers a long-lost book of the law. This is captured in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. But what we see in some of these texts that I think keys off a lot of scholars to a Moses insertion is when God says to Moses in Exodus, "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Those are the patriarchs. They're known collectively as the patriarchs. So I referred to them, or I appeared to them as God Almighty, El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself fully known. I should have used the proper translations here. But God referred to them as God referred to himself to the patriarchs as El Shaddai, but to Moses as Yahweh. So there's clearly, if you're reading skeptically, something's going on here. One of the interesting things, and I'm only going to hint upon it here, is that one possible translation for El Shaddai is God with breasts. And I think that there's clearly a feminine component to the earlier religion, which the Moses sect or the Deuteronomic sect is replacing. One of the implications in Exodus is that Yahweh is the creator God. Now, in an older system, in a system which is henotheistic, one God might be the Most High, but may not even be responsible for creation. And of course, a lot of the Gnostic Christians contended this. Of course, the creator God is a malevolent God in Gnosticism. But in Exodus, we see Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, the God of your patriarchs, and they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. That's the common translation. But one of the things, am is a conjugated to be. So one way to translate this is I cause what I will cause, or I make into being what I will make into being. So this, I think, casts Yahweh as the creator God. So in particular, he's associated with the material, creating material out of chaos, or however they would have seen it at the time. So stepping back and looking at what must have been before these Deuteronomic insertions. In 1928, a peasant in Syria discovered a library of tablets. These tablets are known as Rosh Shamra. They're in a language called Ugaritic, and it's clearly a Proto-Hebrew language. And it's also identified as Canaanite, and it describes a pantheon of gods, which includes El, the sky god, Asherah, his wife, Anat, his daughter, goddess of war and love, Baal, the son of El and Asherah, he's the storm god. This is a pantheon which resembles quite a lot the Greek gods. I mean, you have a similar thing with say Venus and Poseidon and Zeus. But in these tablets, we have stories where Baal defeats the sea god Yam and the god of death Mot. And eventually in the Canaanite tradition and other texts, Baal also defeats the Most High, El, to become the Most High. So we see in Canaanite traditions similar trajectories and similar power shifts and different elevations of gods. But Deuteronomy explicitly names some of these gods, specifically mentions Baal, Asherah. But what's interesting is that the Most High in both Hebrew and Canaanite are El. And so the implication is that these gods were an evolution. These gods were leading into Judaism. And of course, the archaeological evidence supports that as well. But Moses, via Deuteronomy and other places throughout the Torah, he helped to remove those gods from the religion. We see throughout the Old Testament at least a tradition of earlier power grabs which attempted to do this same thing. So, for instance, in 2 Chronicles, King Asa's mother had made a detestable image for Asherah, and Asa cut down her image, crushed it, and burned it at a brook. This is also reflected in 1 Kings. This was, according to the tradition, 900 BCE. Of course, we don't really need to abide by that time frame given our modern understanding of this. They seemed to have a tendency to push things back into history, probably for prophetic authority. So this evolution from polytheism to monotheism, we have direct links by language, geography, explicit references in the Old Testament linking the Canaanites to the Hebrews. There are also non-biblical links which make it clear that Judaism was an offshoot of the Canaanite religion, that the Jewish people came from the Canaanites, and this includes genetic evidence. So several models exist to explain how such an evolution could occur. One is an evolutionary model where polytheism elevates a specific god and it becomes a henotheism where you have a pantheon and eventually other gods get removed and you're left with monotheism. Kaufman in the early 1900s proposed a revolutionary model which rejected the idea that a specific that a monotheism could emerge from a polytheism because of specific attributes of a polytheism, namely that it's out of the chaos that these gods emerge, and you can hack the chaos or tap into the chaos in order to control what the gods do. So Kaufman didn't like that idea that it could be evolutionary given some of the constraints of polytheism and what it would imply. So both of those models are old. What the modern view is that it's a series of convergence and differentiation, which avoids these problematic dichotomies. Basically, this process is a series of cultural negotiation to assert a separate identity and a blending of deities. And so that, of course, is happening between El and Yahweh. So in 622 BCE, we get the beginning of the Deuteronomic Reform, where King Josiah and his high priest Hilkiah locate a long-lost book of the law, which is recognized as most of Deuteronomy. And it specifically argues in support of rejecting polytheistic elements from the patriarchal religion. This would include altars, wooden poles, which were called Asherah. Incidentally, there have been numerous figurines found in Jerusalem of these female pillars. And these pillars, scholars presume, represented Asherah or perhaps her daughter, but probably Asherah. But we eventually juxtapose the old religion with Moses. Moses' interaction with God is preceded by a burning bush. Compare this to the burning of the Asherah poles, which were essentially fashioned trees. So what it appears to be is this Moses story is reworking the rejection of these Asherah in sort of a metaphorical way to sort of rework and integrate Moses. And so the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem happens, I guess 22 plus 13 is 35 years later. So resistance, at least according to the tradition, occurs. Jeremiah, the supposed son of Hilkiah, wrote in 44. But ever since this was in an encounter with Asherah worshippers in Alexandria or in Egypt. But ever since we stopped burning incense to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have had nothing and have perished by sword and famine. The women added, when we burned incense to the Queen of Heaven and poured out drink offerings to her, did not our husbands know that we were making cakes impressed with her image and pouring out drink offerings to her? It's not unreasonable to expect subsequent resistance and memory of an older religion in the subsequent centuries. Pockets of resistance may have and indeed probably did survive in the diaspora. It would not have been welcome in Jerusalem, especially in the Second Temple era, as Jews went back to Jerusalem. But memories of the older religion would have gone through their own syncretistic evolution, interacting with pagan cultures and a natural evolution that one might expect over a few hundred years. In the book of Enoch, the so-called Apocalypse of Weeks, it retells its version of Jewish history. Specifically, in this time frame we're looking at, it says, and after that, in the 6th week, all who live in the temple shall be blinded, and the hearts of all of them shall godlessly forsake wisdom. And so wisdom here, I think, is a clear allusion to Asherah. But we see the wicked priests lost vision because they forsake wisdom. And so in a later video, I'll link these ideas a little more obviously. So let's step back to Gnosticism, looking at Gnosticism through this point of view. There were many different sects and beliefs of Gnosticism, so I don't mean to pigeonhole Gnosticism as one idea. There were Sethians, Valentinians, Manichaeans, Ophites, and depending on what you're willing to take from the early church fathers, probably a lot more than this. They have a curious view on creation, though. That's one of the common themes throughout Gnosticism. Certainly not Jewish orthodoxy, and it wasn't written in Hebrew either. Most of the Gnostic writings are either in Greek or Coptic. But the Gnostic religions tended to include a divine feminine, either Sophia or Barbelo. They tend to view the creator God as lower than the Most High, often malevolent and ignorant. It tends to rely, though, on characters and settings from Genesis. Consider again Exodus 3 and Yahweh's statement, I create what I create. Here we have, I think, a differentiation, or what would have been identified as a differentiation between the creator God and the Most High. And this, of course, runs parallel to Canaanite thought as well. The implication is that Gnosticism is a Jewish diaspora religion, and the implication is, of course, because of the reliance on Genesis as a setting. But Gnosticism is indeed influenced by a great number of other religious and philosophical systems, especially Platonism, but there are also clearly Alexandrian ideas in there. Gnosticism is popular in Syria, Alexandria, and Turkey. It was perhaps influenced by Hinduism as well, and the late Hermann Detering makes various arguments through this in his later works, particularly Traces of Indian Philosophy by Basilides. Gnosticism seemed to remember this earlier version of Judaism, which included more Canaanite elements. For instance, some of those memories included in Genesis 1:26 in their response to it. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. Well, who is God talking to here? Is God a plurality? Of course, it probably is, given what I've demonstrated so far here. But throughout Deuteronomy, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Proverbs, other places throughout the Old Testament, we see memories of these of this henotheism. And I think that the Jewish diaspora Gnostics would have noticed this too. And it gives rise, I think, to the Gnostic penchant to change Jewish orthodoxy, because what they saw, despite maybe not having full access to the entire history, they have some memory of it, and they have access to the Pentateuch, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament. And they would have seen these memories, and they would have had a penchant to discern and rework the stories to remake the story into one that synthesizes all this information. In On the Origin of the World, which is a Nag Hammadi text, it says, Eve is the first virgin, the one who without a husband bore her first offspring. After the day of rest, Sophia sent her daughter Zoe, being called Eve. So this is an integration with the Gnostic story and the Genesis story, as an instructor, as a teacher, in order that she might make Adam, who had no soul, arise, so that those whom he should engender might become containers of light. So the material Adam exists, but it was Sophia or her daughter Zoe who breathed life into Adam. For Adam, having arisen, suddenly opened his eyes. When he saw her, he said, You shall be called the mother of the living, for it is you who have given me life. And then the archons come in, who is this let us make man in our image. Rather, let us, the archons, bring a deep sleep over Adam, and let us instruct him in his sleep to the effect that she came from his rib, in order that his wife may obey and he may be lord over her. So clearly what they're saying here is that the Orthodox tradition is bogus, and that it was them trying to trick humanity. So in this story, Eve puts mist into the archons, the rulers, the material creators' eyes, and secretly left her likeness with Adam. She entered the tree of knowledge and remained there. And they pursued her, and she revealed to them that she had gone into the tree and become a tree. And they acted rashly. They came up to the impostor Eve and seized her and cast their seed upon her. They raped her. First, she was pregnant with Abel by the first ruler, and it was by the 7 authorities and their angels that she bore the other offspring. So notice here, Eve, Sophia, goes into the tree of knowledge. This is a big reworking of the Genesis story, obviously, but this concern for the tree, I think, is definitely something that the Gnostics noticed. They noticed that the tree represented the lady. And this is, I think, clearly something that we can draw a line between what must have been the pre-Moses tradition and Gnosticism. So Gnosticism inverts and rethinks traditional Jewish stories. In the light of the evolution from polytheism to monotheism in Judaism, it stands to reason that, as opposed to rethinking Judaism, Gnosticism actually remembers and reverts back to older stories, older versions of the stories. And of course, if we leave room for evolution and syncretism, we can clearly draw a line here that is fairly blatant in terms of the Gnostic memory of this older tradition. But it certainly, I think, in my mind anyway, debunks one of those models we considered, which was Kaufman's revolutionary model. It wasn't, monotheism was not a reaction to this, and the fact that you can go back from monotheism to polytheism, it's just kind of silly. There's even some indication of a demotion of Moses in Gnosticism. It's not verbosely detectable in Gnostic literature. You do see in the Gospel of Mark Jesus getting elevated above Moses, but in the Apocryphon of John, there's several passages which are following the same theme, which is Moses told you wrong. Moses gave you the wrong information. Do not think it is, as Moses said, above the waters. It's not the way Moses wrote and you heard. And he brought the part which had taken from the power of the man into the female creature, and not as Moses said, his rib bone. It's not as Moses said, they hid themselves in an ark. So clearly, I think the Apocryphon of John is saying here, Moses told you wrong, and think how that might read to a person reading it. When you read 4 distinct things where Moses said the wrong thing, clearly what they're saying here is, don't rely on Moses. So we have what I think, based on the supplementary model, an insertion of Moses after the Deuteronomic texts. You have this Deuteronomic Reform, which keeps some of the old religion, casts away the other gods and worship and other things like that. But there are memories that I think continued throughout the diaspora of this earlier religion, which was henotheistic, which had the most high El versus the lower gods responsible for material creation. This is just like what is being described by Irenaeus and others throughout the heresy texts. But you have this divine feminine, and a different version of creation. And during the years leading up to Christianity, you have an ongoing disintegration of Jewish culture, Holy Land, and the temple. And I think this leads to various offshoots, which included Christianity, Mandeanism, or the John the Baptist sect, and the Kabbalah, which remembers a lot of this stuff as well, particularly the tree. You have contrasted Sophia and the ignorant demiurge and an unknown Most High. So this is in Gnosticism. So compare that to the Canaanite pantheon, where you have El and the wife who seems to be emanating wisdom to the earth. By the way, Sophia is wisdom. And you have the sun who is fighting the material forces on earth, such as Mot and Yam and the sea god Lotar. These parallels are so striking that it's hard to imagine that they weren't simply recast memories of this older tradition. So that's my view of it. That's the end of this presentation. I would definitely encourage everyone to check back in. I was trying to do this once a week. I don't think I'll be able to get one of these out next week, but in the future we'll continue to talk about this divine feminine as well as other things. Some more about the heresies, I think. Some more about the history as described by Josephus. Maybe eventually we'll talk about some of the typical apologist arguments for why Jesus existed and other things as well. So that's all I have to say today. Thanks for watching.